Um, Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming inside on a undeniably beautiful day. I'm flattered by that. Feel free to leave if the temptation strikes to go enjoy the beautiful lawns and trees and gardens all over our beautiful campus. Before I say anything else, I want to offer my congratulations to the graduating seniors who are here or represented by other family members. But congratulations also to the parents and the grandparents and the siblings and the cousins and the friends. This is a great event. It's a very big week. It's a major milestone. And you all deserve some congratulations, and you certainly all deserve to celebrate. My name is Sarah Igo. I am an associate professor here at Vanderbilt of history. But they also like at Vanderbilt to give us affiliations all over the place. So I'm also a professor of political science and sociology. But my main task here is teaching history, both to your students and to our graduate students. I myself arrived at Vanderbilt in 2008, which is right around the same time that your students did 4 years ago. And I want to thank those students for being a real joy to teach. It's been an unmitigated pleasure, really, both to teach and to learn from your students in these years that we've shared the campus. What goes on in our seminars and our lecture halls and our discussion sections here is really dazzling and wonderful. So I have gained much from it. My own, well, actually, let me say one more thing before as people just wander in. One other thing I wanted to thank our seniors for is summoning up really the best commencement weather we have ever had, certainly that we've had in the 4 years that I've been here. I think this is the first time that hasn't been either stormy or sweltering or a combination of the two. So we'll hope it holds out for tomorrow and that everything's just as lovely as it is today. But that, too, is a kind of auspicious beginning for our seniors to begin in such lovely circumstances. My own field is modern American history, and more specifically, cultural and intellectual history. The history of social thought, which is actually something that many of your students, many students I've taught here, have never been exposed to before. So it's been really fun to be part of that. As an intellectual historian, one of the things that most fascinates me is the way that cultural common sense, conventional wisdom, emerges. Why we think the way we do about entities that seem solid and stable, like progress or luck or the economy or modernity. In my own undergraduate teaching, this means trying to unearth the structures that we live within so that we might see our present, our own matter of fact, not as preordained, but as a contingent historical development that's created through human actions and human decisions. The history of privacy, which is my subject today, and also the subject of my current research, is a very good example of this. And I think it's a good example to subject to the discipline of history. Privacy may also be the area of college life that is most foreign to the parents in the room who came of age before the era of blogs, Twitter, MySpace, and Facebook. Really, privacy concerns, privacy issues are very different on college campuses today than they have been before. But I'm not going to talk about the campus so much today, but about the swirling concerns over privacy over the last 100 years, the way that they've changed, and what they might tell us not just about privacy, but about political and cultural life in the United States. So, what's happened to our privacy? This question, although it's by no means new, has been asked with increasing urgency in the United States, as well as elsewhere in the last several decades. If you open the newspaper, you'll find privacy everywhere. Or maybe just I do, I don't know. But it seems clear to me that it's part of almost any topic in our political culture today. From the recent Supreme Court ruling authorizing strip searches for virtually any kind of arrest, to government wiretapping and debates over the reach of the government into citizens' lives, from identity theft to recommendation software of the kind that Amazon.com employs, from the no-holds-barred coverage of celebrities' sex lives and the flood of intimate disclosures on Facebook and Flickr, to the surveillance enabled by cell phone photography, GPS units, and Google Street Vision. Indeed, if one believes the titles of recent books, Americans are in the midst of an unprecedented privacy crisis. A few of these titles, just to give you the flavor, you've probably seen them in bookstores. The Electronic Eye, One Nation Under Surveillance, Database Nation, The Unwanted Gaze, The Naked Crowd, Privacy in Peril. We okay? I think it's all right, actually. I haven't shown any slides yet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I will be, I promise. The Road to Big Brother, this will be the test. Someone is watching you. The End of Privacy, here we go. Database Nation, I mentioned The Death of Privacy in the 21st Century, very dramatic titles. And my personal favorite, No Place to Hide. Oh, now you can see it a little bit better. You might not be able to read the fine print there. When you go to work, stop at the store, fly in a plane, or surf the web, you are being watched. They know where you live, the value of your home, the names of your friends and family, in some cases, even what you read. Where the data revolution meets the needs of national security, there is no place to hide. These titles and the books that are covered by them have the ring, in a sense, of a horror film, right? They're coming to get you. Eyes, watching eyes are everywhere. There's no escape. And I'm interested in this notion that we are in the midst of a privacy crisis unlike we've been in before. As a historian, I am suspicious of those kinds of claims. It seems to me that some of this, what we're seeing now, we've actually seen before. In most of these accounts, there is a shared meaning of privacy which is assumed. That there's something that we know privacy to be, or at least that we used to know what privacy was, and it's fast on its way to vanishing, or perhaps even dying, as some of these books suggest. But there are actually many different strands of privacy talk that are in play today. Our first thought these days is often the growing sense of threat to the security of personal information, whether that's financial or medical or genetic. But this understanding of privacy and the debate about it coexists with a more contested set of worries over privacy understood as the realm of, you might say, bodily integrity or individual decision-making. This second kind of privacy has made its most dramatic appearances in court. Recent battles over the availability of birth control or over abortion underscore the fact that some Americans consider the constitutional penumbra of privacy, which was first enunciated in 1965, to offer not too little, but actually too much privacy to citizens. Still, a third and rather different, again, feature of today's privacy debate concerns not the intrusion of authorities, whether those are corporations or the government, into private life, but rather the extrusion of private matters into the public sphere. The problem here is posed as ordinary citizens' own quest for publicity. Their voluntary divulgences in confessional talk shows, in tell-all memoirs, in reality TV, and of course, Facebook. Here it's not corporations or the state or even journalists that seem to imperil privacy, but rather willing exhibitionists who are eager to share their intimate details of their personal lives with strangers. I think this is well captured in a recent New Yorker cartoon. A daughter is asking her mother, who's just, we assume, stumbled upon her own diary up in the attic, what was the point of writing something that nobody else could read, right? What is the point of having an interior life if you couldn't broadcast it to all your friends and strangers alike? What's striking, I think, in starting to pull apart these different understandings of privacy today is how extraordinarily malleable these understandings of privacy are. Threats to privacy seem to stem from the prying eyes of commercial media and state enterprises, from some citizens' exercise of their legal rights, and from still others' self-expression. What I think this points to is not just confusion, but actually the rhetorical usefulness of privacy as a claim, a political claim and a social claim in the 20th century US. Of course, the 21st century US as well. No one, or hardly anyone, is willing to speak out against privacy. Privacy, it seems to me, has a kind of unusual capacity to organize a wide-ranging set of cultural issues. So privacy in this sense is not private at all. In fact, it is a central category of modern American public life. Sometimes I think it's actually the central category of American political culture. So the question that I've been trying to answer as a historian, puzzling over this, is really how did it get this way? How did we get to this state of affairs that privacy has become so central to American public life and political culture? Although we know a great deal about the formal legal history of privacy, that is the history of privacy rights, especially the constitutional right to privacy, we know surprisingly little about the history of privacy as it was understood by ordinary citizens, its emergence, its evolution, and its resonance as a kind of claim about selves and society. Now, for the historian, privacy is a tricky, if fascinating subject. Privacy deals, of course, with those things that one hopes to keep out of the public eye, and perhaps out of the archive as well. It's a kind of object that tells us it's beyond scrutiny. It shouldn't be looked at. By its very nature, privacy is intangible and elusive. Yet, fortunately, for those who would track its history, privacy is regularly summoned into visibility. It's summoned into politics, and it is therefore visible and traceable by later scholars. In a way, this has been my approach to the subject, looking at where and when privacy goes public and what that public debate over privacy means. One key finding of my research is that this public nature of privacy, its status as a public thing or a public claim, is really a product of the last 100 years, linked to new conditions of political and social life. And here I don't mean just surveillance methods, the kinds of things that we might immediately think of, but actually I think we can link new ideas about privacy to suburbanization, as I'll discuss in a little bit, to the growth of the professions, to the expanding welfare state, the specter of totalitarianism during the Cold War, medical and psychiatric codes of conduct, professional conduct, second wave feminism, political scandals, criminal and terrorist threats, and new media formats. All of these things, and many, many more, we might link to our understandings of privacy today and how it's shaped. Modern privacy, I would argue, is rooted in new understandings of the person and his or her boundaries that have developed just in tandem with those kinds of concerns, new concerns of social life. And precisely because privacy has been billed as a personal possession, outside of the realm of the state, outside of the realm of politics, I'm going to argue that its history offers us an especially illuminating window into the social strains of modern citizenship. That if we just look hard enough at the way privacy surfaces, we might learn something about the very social fabric of the United States in the last 100 years. So rather than join the bandwagon and lament privacy's disappearance, today I'm going to try to track its appearance in public and suggest what this might tell us. So from here on in, I want to take you through a whirlwind tour of modern privacy's history, and that, of course, necessitates explaining just a little bit about when I think modern privacy begins. We cultural and intellectual historians don't usually traffic in dates. In fact, one of my colleagues calls us historians without dates. We don't usually look at specific laws, specific wars or developments that you can put neat categories around. Nonetheless, I'm going to do that a little bit today just to give you a sense of the ways that privacy and privacy concerns, I think, have shifted across the last century. So you'll see that in a minute in the way that I've organized this talk and my research. So it seems evident to me that it was only in the 19th century that privacy emerged as an unqualified positive good in American life. It's in the 19th century that privacy will shed some older meanings that you can connect to its very linguistic history, its etymology. It was associated with privation and deprivation, loneliness and isolation, This really shifts over the course of the 19th century. So that's where I'm going to begin, is the later 19th century, when privacy is acknowledged as a kind of untrammeled social good, and take you on, as I say, a quick tour through 6 moments in this history since then. So the first period of history, which I think, much like our own, was really marked by an engagement with modern technologies of various sorts. And I said history without dates, but I'm talking here about the period roughly from the last decade of the 19th century into the first couple decades of the 20th. Before the Civil War, most Americans seem to have understood privacy as closely linked to the circumstances of their physical environment. But by the turn of the 20th century, a rapid series of technological and media innovations, some of which I've put on this slide here, seemed to place privacy newly in danger. Instant photography was one of these, tabloid journalism, x-rays, fingerprinting, telephones, telegraph technology. Again, I say the resemblance to our time is rather striking here, in that technologies themselves seem to usher in, bring up new kinds of questions about the boundary between one person's life and information and another's. Now, this is not brand new to this period by any means. You can see earlier worries summed up here in a cartoon or an illustration that was commemorating the 1858 discovery or invention of aerial photography here in France. So these concerns are not, as I say, brand new. But in important ways, the press, tactics of publicity, and photography will merge in new ways in the late 19th century. Up until this point, for instance, photography had been a slow and cumbersome process. But the arrival of cameras as a mass medium, which we can date to about 1888 with the Kodak Brownie camera, which is also called the detective camera, so that gives you some sense of how it was greeted. This will change the way that photography intervenes in American life. Here's an advertisement for a Kodak Brownie that even a child or a young woman could use. It was so simple. In 1890, a new word, here's another illustration, inexpensive as well, you can see, $1. In 1890, the phrase, quite an evocative one, Kodak fiends, will enter the American vernacular. It's estimated by this point that about 10 million Americans consider themselves amateur photographers. The key concern here is that they are photographers who can capture people's images surreptitiously. You'll quickly see after the introduction of this camera, new regulations placed on camera use, picture taking in places like the White House, railroad lines, ferries, private property, and so on. There are reports of vigilante committees who patrol beaches, making sure that young men aren't taking pictures of ladies emerging from the deep, in one person's words. This will be coupled, this new facility with photography, capturing images, with new technologies of photographic reproduction. In 1880, you'll see the first newspaper halftone published, and this meant that pictures could not only be taken surreptitiously, but they could be published widely. According to the Boston lawyers, Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis, in 1890, novel methods of intrusion, these are their words, instantaneous photography, and a prurient newspaper enterprise had, quote, invaded the sacred precincts of private and domestic life, overstepping the obvious bounds of propriety and decency. Especially worrisome here to those observers, including Warren and Brandeis, was the idea, the discovery maybe, that invasions of privacy could be virtual. This was not a case of peeping Toms, right, peeking in the window. This was technology enabling people's vision in new ways. And actually, the idea of virtual intrusions is raised first, not by email and other technologies we're familiar with today, but by the compromised privacy of the actual mails. This was an especial concern after 1873, when a kind of communication we don't even think of anymore as a technology, I don't think, but it was a new one then, postcards were first authorized for sale. Postcards were enormously popular with consumers, but they and their users would be vigorously critiqued in all kinds of highbrow magazines and journalism, social criticism, for their role in changing the terms of disclosure of private matters. Just to pluck out one example of that, in the 1910s, a writer for the Atlantic Monthly will lament that those who use this novel form of correspondence, the postcard, quote, reveal secrets supposed to be the most profound, related misdemeanors and indiscretions with a reckless disregard for the consequences. Here they meant curious people, whether at the post office or a bellman, a servant, being able to rifle through the private thoughts of individuals. Now, if this kind of critique sounds awfully close to current criticisms of social networking, the point is not a kind of facile historical parallel, but really the point that privacy has been always a moving target, always in dialogue with new technologies, new modes of living, and social behaviors. Privacy concerns were sparked not just by the postcard, but in a more sustained way by the invention of the telephone and the telegraph. As far as the telegraph, one historian has called the telegraph network, I think quite aptly, the Victorian internet for just this reason. That's because telegrams posed a now familiar dilemma, a trade-off between privacy and convenience. The messages one wanted to send via a telegram required the disclosure of their contents to a third party, and telegraph companies retained copies, meaning that ostensibly personal communications could exist in 3 or 4 separate locations. The immediate discovery, too, of wiretapping by law enforcement agencies and criminals alike meant that the telephone lines were equally open to prying. Also, some of you may remember these party lines that allowed multiple users to listen in on conversations would prompt one contemporary to decry, and I love this language because it sounds so similar to our worries today, a dawning age of electronic exhibitionism and voyeurism. So that's in the early 20th century. New technologies then, in the past as today, seem to make matter-of-fact explanations and expectations about privacy obsolete. Warren and Brandeis, the 2 lawyers I mentioned earlier, would author in 1890, as a result of these new technology and technological fears, a watershed article in the Harvard Law Review called The Right to Privacy. It's actually the first modern attempt to grapple with and define a kind of blanket right to privacy. Here they argued, though, in the interest not of general privacy rights, but rather the privacy of a select few, public figures and other elite Americans, those who asserted that a man's home was his castle and shouldn't be subject to the prying eyes of newspaper reporters, those who had a stake in protecting an honorable reputation, that there might be even a cash value attached to that reputation. I think what this signals is that an old order, and especially the walls sheltering social elites from scrutiny, seemed to be threatened in this period particularly. This was the problem, as one historian has put it, of the problem of access by the lower classes of society to information about the upper classes. And in this sense, privacy was being claimed, or perhaps reclaimed, as a kind of bourgeois privilege. Significantly, privacy would be invoked again and again in the late 19th and early 20th century as a defense against changing conditions of urban life and shifting social mores. But as we'll see, this soon will change. Okay, so I'm going to jump to another period and more briefly describe what I see as a new kind of set of practices and conversations that develop about privacy in the subsequent decade or so, from about the period of the Great Depression to the end of World War II. The Depression and World War II will introduce new kinds of privacy worries, this time through the expansion of the welfare state. Just to remind you of some of the innovations of that period, the Social Security Administration is a good, certainly not the only, but a good institution to think about in this regard. And I think I've got both a slide of the advertising, the kind of publicity around the new Social Security Administration, Social Security check, and the kind of documentation that would begin to be collected about all Americans, or at least those Americans who paid into and received checks out of the Social Security Administration. One key development in this period is what we might call the numerization of personal identity. What do I mean by this? What I mean is simply making American identities trackable and traceable in new ways, making citizens trackable in new ways. It's a kind of article of faith for US historians that in the 19th century, citizens could just get up and disappear. If they didn't like their marriage, they could go out west and recreate their lives, and there was almost no way that they could be tracked down. This really changes with the apparatus of federal tracking of citizens through benefits programs in the 20th century. This kind of tracking of citizens was originally inadvertent. That's important to say. The Social Security Administration was established in 1935 and did assign particular numbers to particular citizens, but in fact it was illegal for those numbers to be attached to citizens in other ways in the first instance. This will change as Franklin Roosevelt and then other federal agencies authorize their use, and then, as we know, Social Securities proliferate. One sign of this change was the sheer scope of the bookkeeping effort that was required to keep all this information about citizens. The weight and space requirements of the Social Security filing system were such, according to the Social Security Board, that there was no building in the entirety of Washington, D.C. large enough or strong enough for the new agency. And here you see something of the sprawl of files on citizens. This is taken at the Candler Building in Baltimore. It was a Coca-Cola bottling plant, and that's where all those files wound up because there was no building in Washington capable of holding those files. As I mentioned, the Social Security Administration first did not permit these numbers to be used for other purposes, but this will quickly collapse. The number is just too useful. And it will swiftly move those numbers from being a single-use identifier to the identification number of choice for both the public and the private sector. In fact, by 1938, you see the first examples of identity theft surfacing, and in fact called that. People masquerading as other citizens in order to collect their Social Security checks using their numbers. Now, one can find some popular dissent, some worry about this kind of visibility for citizens in this period. There are some labor unions that object to the assigning numbers to citizens. They worry that employers will use these Social Security numbers to blackball employees who had been fired, for example. And working women, too, hundreds of them, wind up calling the Social Security Board to ask whether employers would be informed of their age or marital status. This was information that women at the time often falsified in order to get or keep a job, and they worried, too, about this kind of visibility. But in a period that was marked by national emergency, the Depression, the war, the state's claims over the citizenry kept these privacy fears, I would argue, in check somewhat, or at least out of the limelight, much as Franklin Roosevelt's wheelchair was kept out of view in press conferences and newspaper photographs. But what I think of as a kind of subordination of percolating privacy worries in the United States would not last. No matter where one looked on the world stage after the war, whether that was the United Nations, which would endow privacy with the status of a human right in 1948, or, if you like, to the ominous writings of George Orwell, it was clear that the private was becoming a dominant concern of modern publics. I'll talk next about the early Cold War period, and again, just give you a few dates, a few cultural hooks to hang this discussion on. Now, one thing to say about the early Cold War period, of course, is that investigative tactics by the federal government, of course, proliferated in the McCarthy era. You could think of the House Un-American Affairs Committee hearings, the expansion of dossier keeping by the FBI, or the arrival of satellite photography. So you might think that Americans would fixate on the state as the author of their troubles in this period. Yet, it seems from my reading of the period that many social commentators and ordinary citizens in this era instead reloaded their fears about privacy on the suburban home and on the domestic sphere. Now, in some ways, there was more privacy available than ever before for middle-class Americans in this period. The single-family home becomes attainable for many for the first time. The automobile allows, both in its kind of imagery and in its practice, an escape from the crowded cities of the 19th century. And in this period, too, the private sphere was generally perceived to be the most significant point of contrast between the United States and the Soviet Union. There's a lot of celebration of the kind of unique privacy that Americans and Westerners had. Yet, and perhaps precisely for this reason, this was also a period of heightened fears about the fragility of the domestic sphere, not just in totalitarian states, but at home and in other mass democracies. Part of this is raised by what many sociologists termed a new way of living in this period, the development of suburbia itself. This is a photograph of Levittown, New York, which is the first mass-produced suburb. And indeed, this kind of discussion over privacy will be most evident in the anxious debate over suburbia that you see all over social commentary in this period. Suburbs would attract a great deal of attention from social critics as a new way of belonging in American society in the 1950s, away from urban neighborhoods that were mixed class, immigrant places to be, to a new, more homogeneous, standardized kind of living. For Betty Friedan, the author of The Feminine Mystique, surveillance was built into the very structure of the new suburban homes. She said, through the design of open space, which did away with doors and windows and minimized the opportunity for privacy, especially for women. Others recognized that for all that the home was billed as a private sanctuary, it could also be a space that was rigorously policed by peers. I think it's well captured, this critique, in this cartoon from 1957, 1956 from The New Yorker, where you see all these men in gray flannel suits returning to their cookie-cutter homes. The man on the far right is bringing flowers or chocolates to his wife, and you see the anxiety on the other men's faces because they're going to hear about this, right? Sociologist William H. White, in his 1956 study of Park Forest, the suburb that became famous through his study, The Organization Man, would analyze what he thought of as the micropolitics of the social ethic, the vigilance with which suburbanites watched their neighbors, and what he termed the creeping totalitarianism, there's that word again, of social conformity. William White wrote in his study, fact one, of course, about suburbia is that there isn't much privacy. The lack of privacy, furthermore, is retroactive. They ask you all sorts of questions about what you were doing, one resident puts it. Who was it that stopped in last night? Who were those people from Chicago last week? You're never alone, even when you think you are. Interestingly enough, White himself, the sociologist who was studying the suburbs, came under close scrutiny while doing his research. It seems only appropriate. And he noted in a footnote to The Organization Man, one of the occupational hazards of interviewing is the causing of talk. In one of the instances I later learned about, a husband arrived home to be greeted by a phone call. You don't know who I am, a woman's voice announced, but there's something you ought to know. A man stopped by your house this afternoon and was with your wife for 3 hours. So the sociologist, too, gets caught up in some ways into this world of prying eyes, picture windows that allowed neighbors to look in. In the 1950s and the early 1960s, not unlike the case of today, A rash of popular books would sound the drumbeat of privacy's eclipse. And I note a few of them here: The Eavesdroppers, Privacy, The Right to Be Alone, The Privacy Invaders, The Naked Society, and so forth. A whole literature develops really for the first time, a popular literature in the United States about this vanishing value, social value of privacy. Yet, interestingly, and I don't think all that paradoxically, at the same time, much like those picture windows that allowed a view out of and into the suburban home, citizens would worry about their privacy even as they participated in a voyeuristic world of gossip magazines. Just one here, one example of Confidential magazine. And they also began divulging their secrets to strangers, marriage counselors, and personality testers, thereby conversing in a newly common psychological language of self-disclosure. This betrayed, I think, an eagerness to get beyond the confines and constraints of private domestic space, too. The decade to follow, from about 1965 to 1975, will be well known to all of you, I think, as the era when privacy came into a new status in American life. This is the decade where Americans see a burst of arguments about sexual, criminal, and speech rights, which would remake privacy into a subject for constitutional law. And I would suggest this will shift the locus, the location of privacy, onto the individual body itself. This is how Americans talk about it in the 60s and early 70s. There are many signs of this shift. There are new rules that are established for medical and social scientific research in this period, informed consent, institutional review boards. A patient bill of rights will be approved in 1972 by the American Hospital Association. Interestingly here, beyond stating that all patients had a right to privacy, this regulation encouraged respect for the patient's body, stipulating that it be shielded from the view of others. Similar language, with a more radical political edge, could be found in the Feminist Manual of 1973, Our Bodies, Ourselves. But this new respect for the person vis-a-vis professionals or other authorities was demonstrated, of course, most spectacularly in legal doctrine in these years. Privacy law would be remade in a cascade of Supreme Court rulings, beginning with Griswold v. Connecticut, the landmark case that overruled the ban on married couples' use of contraceptives. If the earlier Cold War debate had centered on invasions of domestic space, controversies over privacy in this period would fix more firmly on individual bodies. That ranged from bearded school teachers, people remember this, the debate whether school teachers could, wear their hair as they liked. The bodies of criminals, criminal suspects, all kinds of new rights and regulations around police frisking emerged in these years, or of course, pregnant women in Roe v. Wade. Although Griswold would specifically address and limit its ruling to married couples, which would sanction a normative form of sexuality, the rulings that followed it would decline to privilege the home, the family, or the couple as the unit of analysis. It's as early as 1972, for instance, the Supreme Court extends its ruling on contraceptive use to the unmarried. In this way, we might see privacy as a kind of beneficiary of the rights revolution of the 1960s. It inherits a constitutional pedigree and a civil libertarian inflection, really for the first time. It's that recently that happens. In essence, the protections that Warren and Brandeis, the authors of that 1890 piece on the right to privacy, the protections that they had sought for society's elite were extended in this decade to ordinary Americans. Privacy, we might say, was individualized, made the property not of those inhabiting particular social roles or particular social classes, but it became the property of individual citizens who carried it with them as they traveled through society. The legal codification of privacy rights did not, of course, settle the meaning of privacy. In fact, it probably unsettled it. And here are just a couple of photographs of recent 2004 and 2008 abortion and anti-abortion protests in the nation's capital. Instead, these new rights, especially those that targeted a specifically female body, would amplify conflicts over whom privacy should protect. This is most noticeable, of course, in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade. I want to argue here that privacy in this sense was not just individualized, but it was politicized as a national grassroots movement, two movements actually, and two political parties will for the first time square off on opposite sides of the privacy debate. In some ways, things speed up as we get to the later 20th century. And as the 1970s progressed, privacy talk would, I think, at least as far as I can tell in the sources, would quickly shift again as a response to striking evidence of privacy violations at the highest levels of government, namely the surveillance tactics of the Nixon administration. It's in that decade, the decade surrounding Watergate, that citizens will first mobilize around what they'd known in some kind of low-grade fashion for a long time, since at least the 1930s, that many government and non-government agencies were collecting information about them. Watergate will provoke a new vigilance to citizens' efforts to protect themselves, this time not from tabloid journalists or camera fiends or even their fellow citizens, but rather from the relentless machinery of bureaucracy. As Americans would learn of covert U.S. actions at home and abroad in the Nixon years, secret wars and assassinations, many would develop a sinister view of bureaucracy. And what's especially of interest to a history of privacy is how this distrust of bureaucracy, this distrust of government in many ways, became linked to really mundane data gathering operations. You see this all over the cultural texts of the period. Hollywood films like The Parallax View and 3 Days of the Condor, which took the perspective of lone men, an investigative reporter or a CIA employee who were battling Byzantine plots of shadowy but powerful organizations. You see it too in really one of the most wonderful and compelling films of the 1970s, The Conversation in 1974, that will make a surveillance expert its hero. Citizens, like Hollywood actors, would find themselves ensnared in less dramatic, but no less worrisome conspiracies against their ability to act undetected. Magnetic stripe technology, that stripe on the back of credit cards and other cards. Closed circuit television, right? This ability to see the city in new ways from centralized points of vision. And endless paper trails. Patty Hearst is only the most notorious 1970s figure who will be captured by this kind of surveillance. She's captured actually by bank surveillance video in 1975. The increased use and power of computing would underwrite many citizens' fears during this period, and anxiety would crystallize in the specter of the data bank, a word that will be defined by the New Scientist Journal in 1971 as, quote, a generalized collection of data not linked to one set of questions. But the worry about this process preceded the coining of the word, as awareness of the kind and volume of personal information filed away by the federal government increased over the years. A writer for Life magazine in 1964 would put it this way: most Americans who have served in the armed forces, taken out mortgages or insurance, made large purchases on credit, or worked in defense agencies know that somewhere dossiers on them are maintained. But few people have any notion of the extent of this dossier keeping or of the number of facts and gossip and lies on file on virtually every adult U.S. citizen. There'll be a really remarkable uptick in this period in resistance to data collecting of various kinds. There will be, for instance, multiple proposals in this period through the wonders of computing, to centralize data on Americans in federal data centers. 1965, this is proposed, 1967, 1970 again, but each of these efforts will be scuttled following energetic protests from citizens and organized groups. It's also during this period that you begin to see self-help manuals arrive on the scene that would offer advice on how to protect personal data. One of the first of these is Robert Ellis Smith's 1979 book, Privacy, How to Protect What's Left of It. Already that ominous tone about privacy vanishing. And really around the world, not just in the United States, but in all the Western industrialized nations, privacy would call up, would increasingly mean data protection. In the United States, this would take the form of laws like the Privacy Act of 1974 and the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974 as well. That's the waiver all of our students sign off on in order to get their letters of recommendation. The Educational Rights Privacy Act will be signed into law only 12 days after Nixon's resignation, and it's fairly clear that that domain, though not technically connected to Watergate, is pushed through, that law is pushed through because of events during the Nixon regime. The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act will be enacted out of widespread concern that students, in one editorial, were being locked into a records prison through flawed and potentially quite damaging information in public school files. This act, also known as the Buckley Amendment, would be the product of parent and student advocates and would provide students with access to their records that would have been unthinkable, really, only a few years earlier. So one of the things that I think it's important to note about this development is that changing conditions, bigger databases, faster computers, more centralized bureaucracies, didn't simply erode privacy, even if that's how people talked about it at the time. But it created new victims, new kinds of claims, and ultimately new sorts of privacy for Americans in the 1970s. Okay, well, I'm going to be very brief about the most recent period, partly because it's very hard to figure out where we are in the last decades of the 20th century and the early 21st. But I think of this period under the umbrella term of confessional culture. Certain practices that were seemingly hostile to individual privacy would migrate from state authorities to the citizenry itself in the closing decades of the 20th century. The 1980s and the 1990s would see the rise of novel techniques of spying, invading, and disclosing. You might think of elaborate home monitoring devices, for example, or the outing of homosexual and reclusive celebrities, which became a kind of sport of the 1990s. One of the most interesting developments here was what we might call the domestication of surveillance. Security systems that were first used by the military and then by industry would move into the commercial and the consumer realm. Surveillance of one's own property lines would mingle with voyeuristic excursions across other boundaries as developments in the media, in religious and therapeutic culture would make personal revelations newly prominent in public life. I'm going to let one picture here stand in for lots of developments. The inauguration of the televised talk show, which was pioneered by Phil Donahue, shown here in 1967. These talk shows would take on a more provocative form in the 1980s. This is also, of course, the period where Jerry Falwell and his evangelical moral majority would make narratives of sin and redemption a key feature of national politics. Presidents would speak in a new vocabulary too. And 12-step groups would usher personal testimonies into Americans' popular political vocabulary. To many commentators, all of this would signify not just a shifting of the line between public and private, but a collapse of the distinction altogether. But by now, you might anticipate my disagreement with that story. Taking a longer view, a historical view, I would argue that instead it may have been that privacy was simply being reinvented once again, coexisting more easily with new norms of visibility and confession. Well, I'm going to stop with the tour there and simply try to suggest a few conclusions about what this history might reveal. First, and most simply, it helps us to see what privacy has not been. It hasn't been stable, secure, or unitary. Public understandings of privacy have assumed, I think, recognizably different forms across the 20th century, sometimes lighting on technological developments or domestic invasions, at other times on physical bodies or official records. Even though privacy was almost always invoked as something eternal and immutable in these instances, it's clear that what was obviously private in the 1890s was not the same in the 1930s or the 1970s or today. Secondly, the realm of privacy didn't shift in any one direction. It expanded and contracted, sometimes simultaneously. Privacy's history, I think, might be better told as one of continual reconstruction rather than one of relentless erosion, the story that we're used to from those book titles I started with. Privacy, I think, was always being found, even as it seemed to be lost. And I suspect some of the parents in the room might disagree with me, that this is true even in the era of social networking. Third, as more and more citizens gained admission to privacy protections, the ability to make claims about their own privacy, whether this was women or students or patients or immigrants, workers or criminals, controversies over privacy's meaning escalated. I think privacy crises then tell us something significant about citizenship, about whose privacy we decide to notice and attend to or don't attend to at particular historical moments. The belief that there ever was a consensus about privacy's meaning makes it harder to see the ways that privacy has always been structured by divisions between and among Americans, whether those dividing lines are ones of class or race or gender or otherwise. A kind of nostalgia about a privacy that we used to have, I think, obscures one interesting development, that what's happened since the era of Warren and Brandeis is something like a democratization of privacy. Fourth, and finally, perhaps paradoxically, privacy has undoubtedly become a core part of the state and of Americans' perceived civil and cultural rights, even if they've rarely agreed upon what the contents of that privacy is. Thank you very much. So I think there's some time for questions if people have them or comments. This is very much a work in progress as I'm working on this book, years in the making. So if people have any thoughts or want to talk about it, I'm happy to entertain anything. Yes? Uh-huh.
This is my dozing time, so if you answer this, what can we best do to protect our privacy?
There's a reason I think that most historians aren't policymakers is that, you know, we start hunting around, we find interesting stories and parallels, and there's an incredible freedom in that in some ways, and that we don't have to decide what to do about it. But I do think one of the key problems, and you could see this as far back as the 1890s, is that our laws and our regulations around privacy have a very hard time keeping up with not just technological developments, but social developments. That is, the kind of formal way that we think about privacy and privacy rights and privacy law sometimes don't have a lot of mismatch, or there's a bit of a lag, maybe a lot of a lag, between those two realms. So I don't know how we can best protect privacy, partly because I think privacy means different things to different people and is a term that, as I tried to suggest, covers so many different realms of American life these days. You know, one person's privacy is someone else's invasion, you know, in a sense. That's how we might think about the controversies over Roe v. Wade, how we might think about, you know, the complaints you hear about people talking loudly on their cell phones and trains and subway cars and so forth. So I think we might, and this is a kind of typical historians getting out of the you know, complicated questions like yours. But I do think by recognizing the bundle of things, sometimes contradictory things, that we house under the name of privacy might help us think about how we target and regulate different kinds of privacy, and might open up ways to have a more serious civic and cultural conversation about what kinds of privacy we really do want to protect. So an evasive answer for which I apologize. Yes, in the back.
As you know, there's no provision in either the Constitution or the Bill of Rights for a specific right of privacy.
Yes.
And, you know, there are other issues where there have been formalized efforts to codify certain rights. You think of the Equal Rights Amendment for women.
Mm-hmm.
There was a formal
Mm-hmm.
effort to codify that into the Bill of Rights. It didn't work, but there was that effort. Do you have an opinion as to why there hasn't been a formal effort to codify a right of privacy, particularly with all the current issues, you know, abortion and wiretapping? Why do you think that there hasn't been a formal effort to codify the right of privacy?
That's a great question, and I'm no legal expert, but I do think that one consequence of the location of the right to privacy in the Constitution through the penumbra of rights found elsewhere in 1965 did potentially cut off what might have been a different sort of movement to enshrine privacy rights in a different and less controversial potentially or legally problematic way. Legal scholars, actually, it's interesting, have quite mixed feelings about the way that privacy rights have been formed out of the 1960s. So there certainly have been lots of grassroots efforts to define and find privacy rights, not necessarily in a constitutional way, but in statutes and in civil law. And in fact, what you see is many different attempts to create those, if not rights, at least protections and restrictions, you know, around data privacy, around, you know, there have been all sorts of efforts, video rental privacy and so forth. So in a way, there's been, maybe that's an acknowledgement that it's very hard to cover all these different kinds of privacy under one banner. But there certainly there have been political movements that have come and gone, but most of them have not, you're right, taken up privacy full stop as their subject, but much more particular kinds of privacy. And as I say, I don't know, and I don't actually know that anyone's really written about this specifically, whether that is linked into this finding of a constitutional right that seemed to maybe preclude other ways of imagining this general right. That's a good question. Yeah?
I was thinking that as you were talking about the reconstruction of privacy, that to bring it into the sort of the reason we're all here, our children, your students, will be leaving, and they came in a way with the ability to reinvent themselves. They came from places where they had where people knew something about them, and here they are in a different place, and they had the opportunity to change basically people's perception of them, and also of the ways in which people kept information about them. Now they're going off to another place, and they have that opportunity again. It's a rare thing to be able to reinvent yourself, but as you reconstruct what concepts of privacy is, you have this sort of concomitant or maybe caused reinvention of oneself. And what I was thinking about is the fact that the important aspect of this is what people other people, the others who gather the information, what they do with that information. So many people are not so much concerned, some people are not so concerned, with the fact that somebody gathers the information as much as they are with what they're going to do with the information.
Yeah.
And what it leads to, it seems to me, is a distortion of facts, where the truth no longer exists, because depending on what you know of someone, it is either true or not. You know, what you say about that person is either true or not true, and there's no ability on the part of the person who is the subject of that accusation to change the opinion about someone else without revealing more information about themselves. And so you have this kind of, you can do it with individuals, but you can do it with, you know, you see it, of course, all the time in politics and in other, so I'm just, that was my word.
Well, it's beautifully put, and you are tapping right into some of the conundrums, I think, about our current situation. You described in the outset of your comment a world that maybe we have lost, I think, actually, this world of reinvention. Yes, it exists still, but in fact, the kind of footprint, right, data footprint that we all leave, at least there's actually greater continuity, you might say, between your students, the high school experience and college and beyond, precisely because there's this body of accumulating stuff, right, that's following them, unless they're very savvy, astute users of things like Facebook. That information is accessible. Yeah, right. But one imagines that too. Well, we'll have implants that are tracking. So in a way, that's what your comment evoked for me, is that we might be seeing something really interesting change in this old American dream. I think of the Great Gatsby, right, of reinvention as a kind of freedom. Now, there are many who would argue that this kind of online life allows for another kind of reinvention of all kinds of things, one's social communities and so forth. And there's a utopian strain as well as a dystopian strain to thinking about that. But I do think this sense of records following one about, not just official records, but the record that we are all broadcasting about ourselves will follow, has really vexed educational institutions in some ways. I know deans who, through their access to Facebook have found out about things that students are doing that they would never have otherwise found out. Of course, we know that employers have looked on these sites to find out things about potential employees. And this does constitute a different relationship to our information. And anyone who's ever tried to rectify a credit report that's in error, right, or an identity theft, realizes how much we are entrapped and encased, in some sense, by others' information about us, right? The documents about us speak more loudly than we can ourselves in many instances. So I think this is really one of the big dilemmas, philosophical as well as practical, about our moment of thinking about privacy. Yes?
Looking back on now greater than a century of sort of formalized American law of privacy, would you say that there has been any one predominant social value that sort of ties together the bundle of these rights claims more so than the other? I mean, decency, autonomy, liberty. I mean, there are a whole lot of other substantive, sort of moral and other social values that come up. Is there anyone that has been in the forefront? Because in the continental system, for example, dignity has been recognized as a part of civil law convention for protections of rights, privacy, and we've never developed a parallel.
Yes, right. That's actually the rap on Americans, is that dignity does not occupy this kind of place in our notion of privacy and discretion. And that's really, there's an important piece laying out exactly this difference between American and European privacy law and privacy thinking, which suggests that Americans have much more tended toward the liberty and freedom angle of thinking about privacy, or dimension of privacy, rather than the dignity of the person. In some ways, I think Americans conflate those two things, that in fact one's dignity is rooted somehow in freedom and freedom of action. But it seems clear that that option has not been as resonant in American cultural life and legal rulings as it has been in Europe. And there are all kinds of possible explanations for this. I think when I began thinking about this project, I wondered what the scope ought to be of thinking about privacy as a social value. At one level, maybe the national isn't the right fit. We might think about Western notions, right, of privacy and how they've changed, or a kind of subnational look at how different communities or even different populations within the United States have thought about their privacy. Nevertheless, for precisely the kind of reasons that you're pointing to, I do think there's a kind of national order to our debates about privacy. Even if people don't agree about what they are, they seem to be speaking the same language about privacy many times, and I do think it is probably, if I were pressed to choose one, it is about liberty, or a kind of liberty autonomy sort of strain, rather than honor or dignity or self-respect or one of those other cognate terms for privacy. Yes?
Have you studied the correlation between public fear and the loss of privacy? It seems to me to be rather
Yeah, so and by public fear, you really mean related to the national security, the fears. Yeah. Yeah. Which there are many different kinds of public fear, I think, which enter into this story. So I just wanted to ask about that. Certainly, moments of what we might think of as state repression, crackdown that come out of external foes and fears, I think have been really central in thinking about what kinds of privacies Americans have a right to and which ones that they don't. What I think is interesting, possibly in contrast to our most recent history about the Cold War, is that while, of course, there was all sort of acceptance of state intrusions on Americans' privacy, that there was this deep fear that I tried to showcase just briefly here about the private domain, the domestic, the family, and the ways that those entities which were prized were somehow being infiltrated by the watching eyes of others, which I think in interesting ways gets planted on neighbors, but is actually maybe a proxy for these fears of state intrusion. So you're right, absolutely.
It's acceptable to the public for state to intrude on privacy when it's a matter of public safety and terrorism.
Yeah. Well, no, that's absolutely clear that there's a relationship there. And the follow-up question you might ask is, when that public fear disappears, do the rights return? And I think the answer usually has been not. I mean, sometimes they're undone by other kinds of political movements and mobilizations. You could think about the Nixon administration as an interesting case, where all kinds of new privacy rights are secured. Now, they're imperfect. To go back to your question, the Privacy Act allows for people to access information about themselves in their records. But the bureaucracy around that is also rather impenetrable and difficult to find where you would even look, which agencies are collecting the information that's skewing your that sort of gap between your own sense of who you are and the official version of who you are. So, but there have been moments where there's an attempt to reverse those sorts of violations of civil liberties, but there's been a pendulum swing right back and forth. Any other questions? Yes.
In the past, if you went to shop at a store in a mall, nobody tracked where you went. If you go online to 6 different websites, you're tracked.
Yeah.
You get a cookie, or it's in your cache, or wherever it is.
Yeah. There are lots of people who have been examining this question. It's a real key concern, maybe the key concern for people working at the intersection of law and technology these days. And of course, there are rulings. One was just handed down about MySpace yesterday or the day before. Punitive damages have been assessed against companies that have inappropriately used information or information that violated their own stated privacy policy, for instance. Those are piecemeal efforts. There have been attempts in Congress to create privacy regulations around information. I think for the reason I mentioned earlier, those are always going to be behind the cutting edge of the technology of those who would collect that kind of information. I'll also say that this is maybe an older problem than we recognize. It's true that they're walking around a shopping center in an earlier day, you couldn't be traced as finely. But actually credit histories, credit reports, information about individual shoppers started being collected in the mid-19th century and really flourishes in the early 20th century. There were department stores that kept enormous files on their customers so that they could know when they came in what they had bought the last time. So actually some of these things are older than we think, but what is different is the low cost and the reach of computing. I mean, I do think that computing and databases have made all of this very, very different. Yeah?
And the second part of my question, in the early 20s, with the advent of consumer credit,
Yeah.
how can you possibly have a society with privacy and consumer credit at the same time?
That's a really interesting question. I can say that, again, related to your earlier question, that the United States and European countries, the EU, have settled that question somewhat differently. The European countries have much stricter privacy laws about that require companies, commercial institutions, to justify why they are keeping information for longer than a few weeks at a time. Rather than assuming that it's okay unless someone objects to it. So there's been a different legal and regulatory history that might be instructive for the United States in thinking about how we address specifically commercial data gathering. The suspicion has been almost reversed, you might say. In the United States, the worries have been about things like the census, government agencies collecting information, rather than commercial enterprises, until very, very recently, I would say. The citizens' focus has been on the state, not on commerce, and it's been maybe the reverse in Europe. Yes?
Just to follow up on the technology stuff, from a technological research and development standpoint, there's a lot of work on things like ensuring confidentiality of particular interactions or ensuring anonymity even.
Yes.
And do you have any sense of how, awareness of this work or, its actual application has, grown in society?
There certainly are lots of people thinking about how to do this and how to do it better. I think there have also been another set of people concerned about the loopholes, the gaps in those same systems, right? And taking it as their challenge to be able to reconstruct from supposedly anonymous data, right? Specific people, addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers. So I think that's a kind of tug of war, a technological tug of war, as well as a political one that we're still in the midst of. And my sense is that that's an unsolvable one, actually, that's just going to keep on going on. Now, it may take different shape, different manifestations, but it seems to me that past experience shows that those protections, someone will find a way around them. Not to sound too sinister about it, but I do think that's what at least what we've seen thus far. Yes?
Yes, I'm surprised that you equate people who send their own information out on it. I mean, that dilutes the really serious problem of privacy, which sort of implies that people want to keep this information to themselves. And it shouldn't. It shouldn't be put in
the same
category.
This is a very interesting objection, and one that I have thought about a lot. It seems to me that if we think maybe not about our own individual ideas about privacy, but the way that privacy has been talked about and debated in the United States, that there's always this flip, or these two sides, at least two sides. One of them is wanting to keep things close and keeping control over one's privacy. The other is an urge to disclose, but to disclose as one would like, right? To the people that one would like. And this is absolutely what's been going on in the back and forth about Facebook, right? Every new change to Facebook is greeted by outrage, right? All these people who thought that they were only sharing this information with some are sharing it with more people than they thought. Now, we can say, shouldn't they have known? But actually, it seems pretty clear that most Americans don't know that that's happening. Right.
That's a different question than what it was she asked, though, to me. I mean, the fact that they changed the rules on people
Yes.
without giving them adequate training
Yes.
or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, now they're disclosing to people they didn't mean to, but the fact is that people do disclose a lot of things out on Facebook. And in fact, in my mind, when I tell somebody a secret, it's no longer a secret. It potentially can go anywhere, right? It doesn't matter whether I'm doing it verbally or on Facebook or wherever. So to me, that's different than, part of the problem is, I guess the whole thing is, what's really the definition here of privacy?
Yeah.
And I noticed you never, ever gave a definition of privacy because you were looking at it totally changing all the time. Changing all the time. So, but to me, that's the key here. What do you really regard as privacy?
Yeah.
And privacy, and the thing is, the answer to the question the lady asked before, how do you have privacy? You don't unless you want to go out and retire in the woods someplace and live off the grid.
And opt out of all the systems that that we live within, right?
Even that might be hard if you have to buy the property.
Yeah. Yeah.
Somebody
Yeah.
will find out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, you don't have any privacy in that way. But to me, the thing has always been danger of the misuse of data, not the fact that people have data. And are there ways within the law to combat that? I mean, to a certain extent, you know, we sue people when you've been harmed. So the question is, can we sue people because they've collected the wrong data or used our data in the wrong way?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I haven't really seen any suits that have gone that direction, but I have a feeling that might be where it goes in order to resolve. I mean, that starts to resolve the question in terms of at least to give people the right to protect themselves.
You know, you may know about this, but there has been a recent move to create what's being called a privacy marketplace, where people can give a kind of cash value to their privacy and ensure their privacy in a certain way against uses. This came out of largely uses of people's genetic material without their, you know, that might turn out to be very valuable in the future. Things of that sort. But I think, you know, as a historian rather than a philosopher or legal theorist, that it actually, there's very little utility in trying to come to a definition of privacy. I don't think that we can agree about what that would be, and I don't think it actually represents faithfully what Americans have thought privacy to be. So this is why I don't define privacy. I take a kind of...
With no definition, your scope is never defined.
Yes, well that is one problem in writing a book, you're right.
I mean, you take Roe v. Wade as a privacy issue, and I don't look at it that way. I mean, our bodies ourselves, to me, I thought that was part of the sexual revolution, nothing about privacy. I see where you could make the interpretation, but I'm not sure I agree with it.
Yeah, well, I don't think anyone is going to agree actually on every piece of what privacy is. I think that's part of the point, actually, that this is a term that has such purchase in American political culture, yet we may all be talking about somewhat different things when we invoke it.
To a certain extent, you can't have an intelligent conversation unless you're both talking about the same thing.
That may be true, but one of the things that seems clear to me in looking at how privacy is talked about, not in ideal legal theoretical terms, but in fact, is that this is one of the interesting things, is that people sometimes are talking in different registers about what they think is the same thing, and that may be part of our cultural confusion that is worth sorting out, right? So I do think, you know, to that original question about is there a difference between what's being collected out there and what people are broadcasting, I think that line is very hard to draw these days, because if we do participate in these systems, as you suggest, computer networks, credit systems, and otherwise, it's very hard to opt out, and it's very hard to distinguish what we're broadcasting from what's being assessed about us. You know, one of my favorite humor pieces about privacy in recent years was The Onion magazine, if people know it. They talked about the incredible success of Operation Facebook, you know, as a CIA operation that, you know, perfectly free, yet amazing data that could be collected by the state, and you know, people were giving it away for free, and this was, you know, one of the most effective government policies of all time. And that just, you know, maybe raises the issue, of course, without answering anything, about where that line is between what state or official uses of information are and what people are.
This idea was very, very important. I have thought that too.
Yeah.
That there has to be distinctions made. I mean, you say you can't, but it has to be.
Well, I don't argue that you can't make distinctions, but that if we want to, if I were trying to ratify a right to privacy somewhere, my answer would be different. But if what we want is to understand the complex place of privacy in American public life, I think we can't narrow it to a technical definition. I just think it's so clear that that's not how Americans think about privacy. They don't make clear distinctions between privacy as a right to one's body or but as an abortion right, and the privacy to be let alone, you know, when they're sitting at a coffee shop, or the privacy to, you know, disclose only certain things to a circle of intimates on Facebook. You know, I don't think they're making those fine distinctions. They call all of those things privacy. And what's interesting is, again, to me, perhaps not to you, but as the book I'm writing, is how this term and this concept functions in American culture. I think it's really important and interesting to try to understand that. All right, maybe with that I'll close. Thank you.
How many people know your mother's maiden name?
Right, well, lots of them.